Here's what most operating committees believe about the HR line on their income statement: it's defensible, it scales with headcount and regulatory complexity. It isn't a lever anyone underwrites for a return, it's just the cost of running a company. That belief held for a long time. It doesn't anymore. Since 2017, HR expense has moved from just over 1% of operating expense to nearly 2.5%. Staffing followed the identical shape, not steady drift, two-step changes, 8 years apart, each one roughly doubling what came before. Ask most operating partners why, and you'll get the same answer: overdue investment. A function finally staffed the way finance and IT have been staffed for years. That's the assumption worth pressure testing, because that resourcing didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened across the exact decade the HR technology industry sold as a fix for this. A generation of platforms pitched explicitly as headcount avoidance plays, systems built to absorb the transactional work so the function could run leaner. The technology shipped, the benchmarking is in. Time spent on strategic work moved from 10% to 13%. Transactional work, the layer those systems were built to eliminate, fell 5 points, maybe seven. The spend doubled anyway. The headcount grew anyway. A function cannot be simultaneously underinvested and expanding its claim on every income statement it touches. Something absorbed the new technology spend and the new headcount without releasing capacity anywhere. The plainer read: the company hired people to operate systems that were supposed to reduce the need for people and called it progress. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable. Over that identical 8 years, the one outcome this function most directly owns didn't hold steady, it fell. Global employee engagement, 23% in 2022, 20% by 2025, the lowest reading in 5 years. Two lines, one climbing, one falling over the same window. I'm not telling you the spend caused the decline. That's not a claim the data supports, and it's not the claim I'm making. What I'm telling you is this: nobody has been required to explain the relationship either way. And an unexplained relationship on a line this size is no longer curiosity, it's exposure. Here's the number that turns this from a governance observation into a board conversation. Picture a buyer in diligence, not hostile, just rigorous. McKinsey's own research on G&A composition finds a 4 to 8 point spend gap between otherwise comparable companies, driven almost entirely by the mix of value-added work versus transactional work inside functions like this one. Closing that gap is worth roughly 3 points of EBITDA. 3 points of EBITDA at a typical exit multiple is worth north of 25% of enterprise value. Run it on a mid-sized platform. 400 million in revenue, a 6 point G&A gap versus best-in-class peers is $24 million. Close half of that gap, and you're looking at roughly $12 million of EBITDA improvement. At an 8 times multiple, that's $96 million of enterprise value. Sitting inside a cost line most boards have never asked a second question about. That buyer isn't going to accuse anyone of waste. They don't need to. They only need to show the spend can't be verified. Confidence erodes the moment a data room can't produce a line from a dollar spent to an outcome kept. And right now, in most portfolio companies, that line doesn't even exist. So the real question isn't whether HR spend is too high or too low. Mercer's own benchmarking puts HR staff at roughly one professional for every 90 employees, against one for every 30 in finance and IT combined. By headcount, this function is lean, genuinely lean, and it's still completely ungoverned. Those are two different tests. Adequate staffing and measured return are not the same question. And for 8 years, only one of them has ever been asked. A function can pass the first test and fail the second at the same time, and almost nobody in the building would notice because nobody was assigned to check, which brings us to the actual finding. This isn't a story about a department. This is a story about ownership, or the absence of it. 4 functions touch this line. The CFO sees the budget and controls it, but isn't incentivized around what it produces and isn't held accountable for it either. The CHRO owns the workflow, but is compensated for keeping the function staffed and compliant, not for a measured outcome. The deal team gets one look, pre-close, then hands it off. The operating partner has the standing to demand the connective measurement across all 3, and instead spends that standing on procurement and working capital because those levers already have clean data. 4 capable people, 0 required owners. That's the mechanism. Not incompetence, structure. Information and authority to act on this line are scattered across the building. Incentive and accountability are almost nowhere. And a cost line with distributed partial ownership behaves exactly like a cost line with no ownership at all. Here's what should concern you about more than the HR number itself. The same shape is showing up economy-wide. Management headcount is projected to grow over the next decade. The administrative layer beneath it, the layer the automation was supposed to shrink, is projected to shrink faster. So the coordinating layer expands and the executing layer contracts. That is not a flatter organization. That's a differently shaped one, and it's more expensive to run. If this pattern exists in HR, it exists in the broader org chart, and it's very likely sitting unexamined in at least one other line on your own income statement right now. So what does an operating partner actually do with this? Not cut the budget, not defend it either. Ask the only question that matters. What did this year's increase produce? In a number, not a feeling. And who in this building is required to answer that before the next review? Not just capable of answering it if asked. That single requirement, a named owner across information, authority, incentive, and accountability, is the difference between a cost line that grows on assumption and one that grows on evidence. One company learns this in diligence. When a buyer discounts a number, nobody can defend. One portfolio learns it when the pattern repeats across 5 companies and starts looking less like an accident and more like a structural blind spot every fund carries. One operating principle emerges from both. Opportunities with no owners go untouched, not because no one is capable, but because no one was ever required to look. HR is the only line item large enough to move EBITDA that most boards still review without asking what it bought. That is why I am the go-to for payroll in private equity, nationwide, no exceptions, no rivals. My name is Preston Leahy, and this is the episode of the Portfolio Value Creation Institute. Thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next video.